Welcome to Love and Live Abundantly. I'm Ilona.
I'm Bill. Do you want to love more effectively?
Do you want to live fully and love more courageously?
We talk about what all that means.
And how you can achieve it.
Join us.
Well, welcome back.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Love and Live Abundantly. We are happy to have you here with us today.
Yeah, good afternoon. You were going to, we talked before we came on the air about what our last podcast was. I have an excuse, I'm old, but and that's why I forgot. But so we had to go back and review our last podcast so that we knew where to start from today. So Ilona, would you kick it off?
Sure, absolutely. We were talking really about, making some different choices and, if we want to do things differently, well, we've got to make some different choices. And in making different choices, it's not simply, stopping something, right? It's replacing it with something. And so, an example would be, oh, you go to party with your friends, right? And you have a few cocktails. And so, that may not serve you. And so what can you do to replace that? And, and then that's where like AA meetings come in, right? And you replace that activity of drinking with your friends to being in a more supportive community. And, sometimes when we're growing up, and if we have different addictions or behaviors or beliefs that we grew up with, sometimes it's not always easy to just stop them, right? However, it's always easier if we have something to replace them, replace the old habit, the old belief, the old, actions, coping mechanisms, different things to do. And so Bill actually has a blog where, he shared an example, and so he's going to talk about that a little bit more today.
Well, shameless plug. The blog is DRMOCK, living better, all one word, .com. So if you want to, I actually did a post on this, and our discussion, I think our discussion last time was in the back of my mind because that's I recalled this incident from my past when I was traveling one time that kind of illustrated this, I thought. There, I happened to, let me just tell the story. I happened to be in an airport. And as sometimes happens, the connecting flight that I was supposed to be going on had some kind of problem. It was just not right. And that meant that they were going to have to get another plane there, but they didn't have one. And so they were flying one in, which meant that we were going to be sitting there for a considerable period of time. And I was waiting in one of the waiting areas, and there were 4 people there with me. And it turned out that, being the bashful guy I am, I started talking with them. And it turned out that they were also connecting as I was. And they had been on a trip to celebrate the anniversary of the older couple. And the older couple, forgive my memory, but I think it was 35 years. And they were just a wonderful group of people. Being in the business I'm in, I sometimes notice, maybe more than I should, when people are really effective with each other and really loving and functional. And it turned out that there was this older couple and they were celebrating their anniversary. And the younger couple was actually the daughter of the older couple and her husband. So the son-in-law, the proverbial son-in-law. And so I got to sit there with them and transact with them for a while, and I was having a good time. I was really enjoying it and enjoying their company, and realizing that a lot of the things over the years that I would talk to couples about um, the hallmarks of really good relationship, the one that was working, and how people were respectful and loving of each other. That these folks were really the poster children for that. And I particularly, I'm a guy, so I was watching the fellas, and I thought, well, that's really cool. I like doing the way they do that. And I realized coming up as a young man, I used to watch my uncles, and there was a mob of them and other men in my life, and the way they operated with their spouses. And I learned without knowing I was learning it through modeling that how to operate with women in your life. Um, and as we're sitting there, we knew that we had a couple more hours to kill. So the two women got up and started roaming around. There was a series of little shops there that were all but empty, and they went over and they were browsing. And while they did that, I took the chance to ask the two men, to share my observations with them about how cool they were in their relationships, and how did they do that. And the older man shared with me that he had never considered that. It was just natural. It's what he did. It's what everybody in his family always did. And he came from a big family, and there were rules about how you're going to behave, and if you didn't obey those rules, people took you aside and helped you right your ways, and that you didn't even have to do that because you saw it around you all the time. And I think we overlook how much of our behavior is actually acquired just by modeling. uh,
Absolutely.
and I thought, I thought, gee, that's wonderful. And I looked at the young man and he said, well, my story is different. I didn't come from that kind of family. I didn't have the slightest idea. I wasn't real happy with the way I saw people in my family transacting, and I wanted to not be like that, because I really loved that woman I was marrying, and I didn't know what to do. And of course, the father-in-law had had a talk with him before the wedding that you better treat my little girl right, that kind of thing. Now, I, I own being guilty of doing that myself. But don't you know, the younger man had a real insight that he didn't know what the hell he was doing, and that he really wanted to, but he knew somebody who did.
Well, and I
And
think I think the
the,
fact that he had even that awareness, right? Like he was aware of, okay, I don't want to model my own family. I love this woman and I want to do the right thing. I think awareness is like the first step, right? So
that
go on.
well,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
but it's not enough to say I don't want to be like that. And I think his next step was even more important, and that was, well, where can I figure out how to be? And what do I watch? Father Knows Best on television, or Ozzie and Harriet, or is there a good model somewhere closer to home? And he wisely decided that I like the way this guy operates with his wife, my father and mother-in-law. And I think I'll watch him, and maybe I can pick up some tips. And he did more than that. He actually sat down with his father-in-law from time to time and asked him for tips, and said, how do I get along with this? And how do I deal with this kind of a thing? And what if I'm really angry? Do I have a right to operate in this way? Or what do you do when you're in the middle of an argument? And that kind of stuff. Um, and the father-in-law looked a little bit surprised, and that was somehow unusual to the young man, because apparently it was one of those things that happened in the father-in-law's family all the time. That was just natural. And the young man had to learn that and to become a better and better and better husband. And he had recently found out that they were about to have a baby. So he thought that that would also make him a better father. I that was my last blog entry was that story. And the bottom line is that the young man could have done as Ilona said, he could have said, "Oh, I'm just not going to be like them," which in my experience almost guarantees that he would. Instead, he said, "I'm going to be like somebody else. I've got to figure out what that looks like." And he had somebody sitting in front of him who showed him what that looked like. And he decided to begin to adopt that. I ended that blog with a great story. Not that the last story wasn't a great story, but I used to read the newspaper a lot. For those of you who are younger, that was a large piece of paper that came with print to your front door. It wasn't on the TV. And one of my favorite columnists was Ann Landers.
I remember Ann Landers.
Yes, and her sister Ask Abby. But Ann Landers did a couple of things in her, but she told a story of sitting in a restaurant one time and eavesdropping on a similar kind of couple, where a man and his wife and the in-laws, and they in this particular case, in Ann Landers' case, the man was the younger man was the son, and she was the in-law. Anyway, they were sitting at the table, and the older couple began having a little dispute, an argument, a disagreement. And the old man said, "Well, honey, perhaps you're right. Uh, let's think about that." And a few minutes later, the two women got up to go powder their noses, to use a phrase. And the young man turned to his father and said, "Dad, you were right. Why didn't you press it? I mean, why didn't you argue some more? Why didn't you make her understand?" And the old man said, "Son, if you want to stay married for a while, you got to pick the hill you're going to die on." And I thought, well, yeah, now that's a good piece of advice.
Well, and
Some
choose your
things are
battle.
important and some aren't. And
Right.
that young man learned a valuable lesson that day. And
Yeah.
you got to pick sometimes it's just not, sometimes even if you win, you lose.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
choosing your battles, right? And what is really the most important thing, to win that argument or to be happy?
Yeah. And my uncle Leo, God love him, he's gone now, but he would argue and argue and argue until he won the argument. And then a month or so later, he'd come back to you and say, "I won that argument last time, but I was wrong." It was more important. The truth and what was right and what was wrong was more important to him than, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that sometimes even, just like in your first story where the elder, looked at the son-in-law and didn't understand why it wasn't his common practice. To realize not everybody is brought up in the same ways and has the same values, um and that is not I feel like that elder's family and ways of values is a minority.
Well, it certainly feels that way, doesn't it? I sometimes think that people uh, engage in a relationship, and when it doesn't work out 100% right away, just the way they want it to, that they give up too soon. They don't even give themselves the chance to learn the lesson.
Well, and I I have told one of my friends this, she dates and then she complains about these men and how, they leave mess all around. They don't clean up after themselves. He's working on one thing and he leaves the cup. And I said, well, did you want to marry a hairy woman? Like men are single focused. And so they don't tend, they fix one job and then they leave the stuff around and, then they go to the next job. And so that's just not a characteristic of a man. I'm not saying it's not for every man. However, it's like, well, do you want him to be more like a woman, like a hairy woman, or do you want a man? Like you have to decide because you can't expect a man to do the things that are common for you. And I think that
Mm.
common for a woman, right? The way that a woman handles things in, like, we're really good at multitasking. Men are single focused, usually not the greatest at multitasking. And so wanting a man to have women characteristics, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Don't you think too that sometimes when you get into that cycle of trying to make the other person be somebody different, that what gets lost in all of that is what drew you to them in the first place?
Yeah,
All that you forget all the positive things that they brought to the dance. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
I fortunately I have a stand-up shower because um, in our first house we had a bathtub, and I'm guilty. I'll own that I didn't wipe the tub out because you get a ring and all. Yeah, that I didn't do that, but I don't have that problem now in my stand-up shower, don't you know? But my wife, once in a while, would say, "Why don't you wipe that out?" And I said, "Well, wouldn't it just be easier if I didn't take a bath?" And that just, she threw her hands up and said, "You're such a man." Yep,
Yep,
that's
I
right. Yep, that's right. Yes, and aren't you glad?
am. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But by the way, we lived in that house for 11 years, and toward the end there, I did get around to figuring out how to do that. It
But
just became second nature, but it took
yeah,
her that long to train me.
yeah. Well, and I mean, I don't know if she continued to ask you about it. Um, However, it goes again back to choosing, what you're going to stand for and what your battles are, you
Mm.
know. Um, so I think it's a bit of compromise too, and understanding and choosing your battles and what's most important. But I want to go back to the young man who didn't know necessarily how to create the family that his father-in-law created. And, you know, clearly his upbringing wasn't the best. And I think, we said awareness is the first step, and then making the decision to choose something different. I feel like a lot of people want a different outcome. However, they're not willing to change anything or, make a different choice. And either it's, like we're just stuck in our belief system or our programming or, the way that we handle things. And for me, on the beginning of my journey, I was like, oh my goodness, I had no idea how I was holding myself back. Show me more, you know? And I was open to looking at things differently. And even along that process, I found myself getting in my own way and feeling scared and wanting to control things. And however, I would keep moving through, I would go back to, okay, if I want different results, I need to make different choices, or I get to make different choices to create the outcome that I want. And what do you think that takes? I mean, is it just a mindset that people have? I mean, I guess it could be a bunch of things too, where people are frustrated, they've hit rock bottom, and they finally realize that what they've been doing isn't working.
Well, that there's a phrase in 12-step programs, it's hitting bottom, where you just can't take it anymore. You're sick and tired of what's going on. But I don't know that that's enough. I mean, I know that people who live for years and years and years in that kind of despair. I think if I could just change a little bit in a little bit different direction. When I was in practice, I had a bunch of students and new employees who were therapists, and they would come to me and I would supervise them, and we'd be talking about their cases, and they'd say, well, I got this client, and boy, if they would just do as I tell them, by God, they would be so much happier. But they're being resistant. And man, that was a word that got used a lot in the various training programs I was in. And I realized, of course, people are resistant. Of course they are. Because if there is a rule in my business, it's that anxiety is the energy that drives all kinds of things. And any kind of change at all that happens in your life that you want to institute in your life, however positive, still provokes anxiety. It's scary. And you can't call that resistance. And I always told them, listen, of course they're resistant. Of course they're scared. Uh, uh, Maybe you're asking them to take off too big a bite.
Well, and two, I feel like that resistance goes back to people's trauma response and how
Mm.
they handled things, previously. And that's normal for them. That's comfortable for them. That's all they've known. And at one time it saved their life,
Mhm. And
right?
so however irrational those fears are, that if
It's
I don't do it that way over and over and over again, that bad thing that I was trying to avoid will happen. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And too, our brain and our nervous system keep us it. So now they know how to handle that trigger or that response or that experience. And so it's now comfortable with that to some extent, right?
Mhm.
Where it continues to protect us in some ways, even though it holds us back in a whole bunch of other ways.
I'll tell you, one of the other things that keeps people held up is when I might suggest to somebody, gee, you might want to try this, operate in this way. This is a better way to operate. Part of their resistance, I think, is, well, gee, if I start doing that and I hate it, I'll be stuck with that. Because their whole experience tells them the last time I tried something, I got stuck with it. And now I'm 35 years old. I've been stuck this whole time with it. And so one of the things that I used to tell them was, no, you're not stuck with it. I don't even want you to change. Try that thing as an experiment, just once or twice, to see if you like it. I'm not asking you to change forever and ever and ever. And that really is, as irrational as that is, that's what so many of my clients thought I was asking them to do. No, there's
Well,
50 different ways to be. Go ahead and try one of them.
yeah. And I like to use I'm all about words, right? And so, when I'm talking to, people who've experienced trauma and if they want to work with me, I use words like discover instead of learn, right? I mean, you're learning, however, discovering, right? Like that feels a little bit less constricted, right? Like you get to discover, you get to choose what it is that you take away from this. You can choose to learn or not, but you get to discover. And I feel like it gives a different feeling for people. Um, and like for me, I was very open to unbecoming all of the things that weren't mine. However, I was resistant over time. And then, you know, And then I broke my leg a few months ago, and it's like, yep, you know what? This shit doesn't just happen for no reason. What are the lessons behind it? Right? Like, what am I going to take away from it? I could have again went into victim mode, and I was probably there for a couple of weeks, and then I made a different choice. And it was like, okay, I would go back and forth with, okay, this is happening, for something else, or I choose to look at it that this is happening for a reason. And what do I get to learn from this? And what are my takeaways from this experience? I don't like to say roller skating accident. I like to say roller skating experience, right? Because I don't feel that anything is an accident. It's all an experience, and I get to choose to look at it differently. Now, had I kept on that victim mentality, would I be as healed as I am today? Would my mindset be back to where it is today? Probably not, if I've not
Maybe not.
chosen to be more positive. If I was, because I could have went down, oh my goodness, nothing works out for me. How the hell did I do this? Why did I do this? What a jerk, like I could have beaten myself up. I could have. However, making that choice, right? And like, okay, this is what it is, and I get to, choose to make it a positive than a negative.
Yeah. There, there are times when being negative on yourself is a defense mechanism for people, that I'm going to beat me up before somebody else does.
Yeah.
And that can be one of the reasons. And I'm not saying that was in your case, but I just drew a blank on what I was about to say. Isn't that awful?
Well, so back to you. And no, so I was, because my one of my defaults was, what are you, a dumbass? And like, I don't know where I learned that from, maybe my mom, and that's okay. I don't blame her. She was doing the best that she can, but like that was kind of the ingrained, like, what are you, a dumbass? Like, you're 50 years old, Ilona. Why are you going roller skating? You
Well,
dumbass.
well,
However, huh?
is this your salute?
You know what? About 20 years ago, it probably would have been. I've done a lot of I've done a lot of this work, right? That's not my go-to anymore. So
There's a similar thing in my business, and we call that positive reframing. That single incident, if you're inclined toward the negative, you could do that. You could say dumbass and pound yourself in the head and ask yourself what's wrong with you. Or you could say, this stuff on my leg, this tape that I'm wearing to stop the pain in my leg and all that and help me heal. That's my badge of courage. I did something courageous, perhaps mistimed, maybe should have done it earlier in your life, but you could choose to see that as a badge of courage. At least I tried. Or
yeah,
you could say, what was wrong with you? What were you thinking?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and that reminds me too of, me taking a risk and moving from New York to Arizona, 21 years
Mm.
ago. I always said, I'd rather say I tried and failed than I wish I would have. And it's been a really great experience. So on that note, we are coming to an end.
We are? Mm,
We are.
wow.
Yeah, I know it went quick. It always goes quick. And so we would love to hear from our audience. So if you are out there and you are listening, please send any questions or comments or things that you would like for us to discuss. You can either comment if there's an available comment section where you're listening to this, or you can reach us at hello@truthbetold.world.
And saying that again, can't say it too often. Hello at truth be told, all one word, dot world, as in this, I'm your world.
And don't forget to check out Dr. Mark's blog. It's Dr. Mock. Living
Living
better.
Better. Yes, DRMOCK, livingbetter.com.
There you go. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Yes.